Hey everyone, this is Renzo with Phantasmic, and today we're talking about Godzilla Minus One. We're keeping this review spoiler free, but if you want to see us do a video where we go into sort of the nitty gritty about the film, let us know in the comments, or smoke signal, or throwing a rock through our window, whatever our works. So I saw this at New York's Japan Society the other night, and they do some really great work showing new and classic Japanese films. I go there a lot. Godzilla Minus One comes from Takashi Yamazaki, who's a very prolific director, but I've only encountered a little bit of his stuff in the past. I remember like years back, I was covering the New York Asian Film Festival, and I watched his Space Battleship Yamato live action movie, and I was pretty blah about that, but a lot of folks really like his, Doraemon and Lupin films. He did a Dragon Quest animated film for Netflix. Kind of like in the same way that Hideaki Anno plays with his toys. Anno's got Kamen Rider, Ultraman, Godzilla, and Yamazaki's over here with, Dragon Quest, Doraemon, and Lupin. And now it's getting his turn with Godzilla 2. He also has a bit of a tokusatsu and special effects background. Vintage Henshin did a really great video about his earlier tokusatsu film Juvenile. And I'll include a link to that in the show notes. You should absolutely check out Vintage Henshin. They do some marvelous work. But anyways, Godzilla Minus One is set in 1947, the immediate aftermath of World War II. And this is a film very much about the war and how the wounds are still fresh for a lot of people at that time. Same way Shin Godzilla is about, the 3/11 disaster, the Fukushima meltdown. This is about World War II. Basically, wherever there's mass destruction and trauma, Godzilla follows. But yeah, because keep that in mind, like, this is 1947. Japan is just starting to rebuild. There's a scene in the original Godzilla from 1954 where, people are on the train and they're like, geez, are we going to have to go back to the shelters? And here in this film, it's like not like, gee, are we going to have to go back to the shelters? That was a while ago. Now it's like they barely pulled themselves out of that rubble. Tokyo is still largely destroyed. And this film deals in a lot of World War II imagery. The legendary films have always been kind of gun shy about associating Godzilla, with the A-bomb, but Minus One has, pretty outright depictions of, imagery reminiscent of, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, talking about kamikaze fighters, talking about the war, the fire bombings. It gets, pretty heavy. Though oddly, even though this is a film set during the American occupation, you never see any American GIs, which I thought was a little odd, but it kind of, maybe, in the grand scheme of things, this movie's kind of a character piece, and there's only so many things that you could fit in this film. But let's talk a little bit, about the characters. So the lead in this is played by Ryunosuke Kamiki, and he plays a kamikaze fighter that survived the war, and now he's come back home, and he's basically a pariah. I didn't realize going into this film that I had already seen several other movies that he was in. He's kind of a big name actor in Japan, but he was in the anime Your Name. He was the lead in that. He was the giant baby Bo in Spirited Away. He was in the Takashi Miike Great Yokai War movies. He was in Survive Style 5, which is, as a little kid, he was in that movie. And that is a really underrated and bizarre film. He plays a little boy whose dad becomes hypnotized and thinks that he's a chicken. This character that he plays is a kamikaze fighter that comes home, didn't die in the war, and now he's kind of a pariah. Like I said, this film deals with, some pretty heavy and dour issues, but at the same time, it's a pretty schmaltzy and melodramatic film as well. And if you like melodrama, this movie does melodrama well. That's kind of, the director's whole wheelhouse. That's his thing. Um, I will say, though, it kind of made me appreciate Hideaki Anno's weird idiosyncrasies in Shin Godzilla. But, after the writing in the legendary Godzilla films, I will absolutely take Yamazaki's melodrama and earnestness any day of the week. Yeah, I would call this movie a crowd pleaser. And that's not to say that it's entirely frivolous. It definitely deals with heavy subject matter, the effect of World War II on people, PTSD, survivor's guilt, the A-bomb. But at the same time, you have these characters that are these very broad archetypes. You have characters like, the nerdy scientist, the grizzled veteran, the anxious rookie. A lot of scenes where people look longingly at old photographs. But like I said, that's Yamazaki's thing. That's what he likes to do. And like I said, it's melodrama, but it's done well. I'd say that kind of like whiplash of absolute horrible atrocities and followed by weird, kind of uplifting or schmaltzy, bits. It reminded me a little bit of an Osamu Tezuka manga. If you read something like, Buddha or MW or Otakiri Hito, a lot of these manga will have scenes where something really horrible happens to the characters or something very sad and poignant, but then it's immediately followed up by a small gag, which isn't to say Godzilla's exactly like that, but in that sort of hemisphere. Let's talk about the other lead in the film, Godzilla. Godzilla is particularly mean in this movie. It's a more ferocious and unsympathetic Godzilla. If you watch, a lot of the older films, even when he's a bad guy, there's a King Kong aspect to him in the sense that the film will sometimes remind us that, he's an animal. He's an innocent. He's also a victim. He was also scarred by the bomb. He's a victim of radiation. But in this film, it doesn't really have one of those moments. It has Godzilla just being pure wrath, just absolute rage. Which also Shin Godzilla did. And I think in the context of Shin Godzilla, Godzilla was sort of representing the tsunami. He was representing, that disaster. So in a sense, it kind of makes sense that he's not as much of an animal in Shin Godzilla. He's more of divine retribution. He's something otherworldly. This -1 Godzilla is an animal. He roars, he gnashes, he's angry, he emotes. One of the places where this film really excels is the visuals. You can tell Yamazaki really approached this with a clear vision. And this didn't just materialize out of nowhere. In the early 2000s or mid 2000s, he did a series of films called Sunset or Always Sunset on 3rd Street. They're basically films set in 1950s Japan, and they're these kind of they're like dramedies. They're a little rose tinted, but in one of the films that was done in 2007, there's a sort of dream sequence where one of the characters is driving through Tokyo that's completely wrecked and Godzilla's attacking it. And even though this was all the way back in 2007, you could tell looking at this scene was basically a demo track for this film. Yamazaki's been waiting a long time to play with these toys. Even the design of Godzilla in that scene is pretty close to how Godzilla looks in -1. And then in 2021, Yamazaki designed a ride for Universal Studios Japan. It's one of those rides where it's you sit in the chair and there's a screen and it shakes. But he directed that film and he designed Godzilla for it. And once again, that Godzilla looks, really similar to the Minus One design. The Minus One design is kind of like a mishmash of elements. Like, it's a little bit Heisei Godzilla. It's there's some aspects reminiscent of the Legendary Pictures Godzilla with some of the scales and the texture, and in some way it reminds me of the GMK Godzilla. But Yamazaki's approaching this really from a strong vision. He knows what he wants, all right, and he did on $15 million what the Legendary movies couldn't do on $200 million, which is make a really visually striking Godzilla film. Like, if you put a gun to my head and told me to tell you about like what was the style of Godzilla versus Kong, I'd be like, I don't know, it was bright and noisy. There were some cool shots, I guess, but Godzilla Minus One has some really striking visuals that he knows how to portray Godzilla. Godzilla looks absolutely massive. He feels enormous, which is funny because actually, scale-wise, he's the exact same height as Godzilla was in 1954. 50 meters tall, but that's not particularly giant by today's standards. But keep in mind, this film is in 1947 Japan. A lot of the city is still practically leveled. Like, there's a great scene. Well, I said this is spoiler free, but like I said, there's Japan is just starting to rebuild, so Godzilla is obviously going to tower over much of the landscape that he's in. As much as I enjoyed this movie, and I really enjoyed this movie, I'm kind of hoping whatever Toho does for a Godzilla movie next has him actually fighting a monster. I mean, granted, we've had like the two Netflix series. There was the recent Godzilla Fest where they put out a short film with a newly made Jet Jaguar suit and Godzilla teaming up. And there was also a CG short film where Godzilla fights Megalon. So there's other places where you can get your monster fighting fix. But, Godzilla Minus One isn't about monster fighting. It's about this very, human struggle. It's basically, trying to find out what's worth living for and what's worth dying for. Yamazaki's Godzilla Minus One, Anno's Shin Godzilla, these are films that definitely have a directorial voice to them. They have, I said this already, but they have a vision. Someone went into this being like, this is what I want Godzilla to be. And, compare that to Godzilla versus Kong or Godzilla King of the Monsters. That feels like the vision of some executives in a boardroom. This is it's a Godzilla that's going to tug on your heartstrings. I'm sorry to drag out a cliche like that, but this film kind of likes cliches a little bit. But it does, if you're going to do cliches, do them well. And I will say, I think this movie does them pretty well. So yeah, go see Godzilla Minus One, and thank you for listening.